The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as Sarah Mitchell sat in her car, staring at the imposing glass building before her. Her right arm hung motionless in a sling, the cast extending from her shoulder to her fingertips like a white prison that had become her new reality. 3 weeks had passed since the accident, yet the memory remained crystal clear in her mind, playing over and over like a broken record she couldn't turn off. Sarah had been a Navy SEAL for 8 years, one of the few women to earn the coveted Trident pin. Her life had been built around physical excellence, mental toughness, and the unwavering belief that failure was not an option. She had survived the grueling BUD/S training, completed multiple deployments, and earned the respect of her male counterparts through sheer determination and skill. Her right arm had been her dominant force, the tool that helped her excel in everything from marksmanship to hand-to-hand combat. Now, as she flexed her fingers inside the cast, feeling the sharp pain shoot up her arm, Sarah wondered if everything she had worked for was slipping away like sand through her fingers. The doctors had been clear about the extent of the damage. The accident during a training exercise had resulted in multiple fractures, torn ligaments, and nerve damage that might never fully heal. They spoke in medical terms about percentages of recovery and permanent limitations, but Sarah heard only one thing. Her career as an elite warrior was hanging by a thread. The accident itself had been a cruel twist of fate. During a routine rappelling exercise, an equipment malfunction had sent Sarah plummeting 15 feet onto rocky terrain. Her instinctive reaction to break her fall with her right arm had saved her from more serious injuries to her head and spine, but it had come at a devastating cost. The sound of bones breaking had been audible even over the chaos of the rescue operation that followed. As Sarah finally gathered the courage to leave her car and walk toward the hospital entrance, memories flooded her mind of better times. She remembered the first time she had held a rifle, the way her father had patiently taught her to aim and fire at their family farm in rural Montana. Her father, a former Marine, had always told her that strength came not from the body but from the mind, but now Sarah struggled to find truth in those words. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and the sterile smell of disinfectant immediately filled her nostrils. Sarah had grown to hate that smell over the past weeks, as it reminded her of weakness and vulnerability, two things she had spent her entire adult life fighting against. The reception area buzzed with activity as patients and families moved through the space, each carrying their own stories of pain and hope. "Sarah Mitchell for Dr. Rodriguez," she said to the receptionist, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The young woman behind the desk smiled sympathetically and directed her to take a seat in the waiting area. Sarah chose a chair in the corner where she could observe her surroundings while keeping her back protected, old habits from years of tactical training that seemed almost silly now in this civilian environment. As she waited, Sarah watched other patients around her. An elderly man struggled with a walker, his movements slow but determined. A young mother bounced a crying baby while trying to manage paperwork with one hand. A teenager sat with his leg in a cast, texting furiously on his phone as if nothing had happened. Each person seemed to be dealing with their challenges in their own way, and Sarah wondered what her way would be. Dr. Maria Rodriguez had been Sarah's orthopedic surgeon since the beginning, and their relationship had developed beyond the typical doctor-patient dynamic. Dr. Rodriguez was a former Army medic herself, and she understood the unique challenges that military personnel faced when dealing with serious injuries. When she emerged from the back office and called Sarah's name, there was both warmth and concern in her expression. "How are you feeling today, Sarah?" Dr. Rodriguez asked as they walked down the hallway toward the examination room. It was a simple question, but Sarah knew the doctor was asking about more than just physical pain. The psychological impact of her injury had been as challenging as the physical recovery, and both women understood that healing required addressing both aspects. "Frustrated," Sarah replied honestly. "I keep trying to do things the way I used to, and my body just won't cooperate. Yesterday, I tried to open a jar of peanut butter and ended up throwing it across the kitchen in anger. This isn't who I am, document. Dr. Rodriguez nodded with understanding as she held open the door to the examination room. Let's take a look at how everything is healing, and then we'll talk about what comes next. I know this isn't easy, but I want you to remember that healing isn't always a straight line. Sometimes we have to take detours to get where we're going. The examination was thorough, but gentle. Dr. Rodriguez carefully manipulated Sarah's arm, checking range of motion and testing nerve responses. Sarah gritted her teeth through the discomfort, refusing to show weakness even in this private setting. Years of military training had conditioned her to push through pain, but this was different. This pain represented limitation rather than temporary challenge. The bones are healing well, Dr. Rodriguez said as she reviewed the latest x-rays on her computer screen. Better than I expected. Actually, your physical fitness before the accident is definitely working in your favor. However, we need to be realistic about what full recovery means in your case. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she braced herself for the conversation she had been dreading. How realistic are we talking? You'll regain significant function, but probably not 100%. The nerve damage means you may always have some numbness in your fingers, and your grip strength will likely be compromised. For most people, this would still allow for a full, productive life. But for someone in your profession, the words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Sarah stared at the x-ray images on the screen, seeing the metal pins and plates that now held her bones together. They looked like foreign objects that didn't belong in her body, constant reminders of her new limitations. What about desk duty? Sarah asked, though the words felt bitter in her mouth. Administrative work, training roles, that kind of thing. That's certainly possible, depending on what the Navy decides. But I know you, Sarah, and I don't think sitting behind a desk is going to satisfy the warrior in you. We need to start thinking about what else might. As they wrapped up the appointment and scheduled the next visit, Dr. Rodriguez handed Sarah a business card. There's someone I'd like you to meet. Her name is Jennifer Walsh, and she runs a program for veterans dealing with life-changing injuries. She was Special Forces herself before an IED took her leg. I think talking to her might help you see some possibilities you haven't considered. Sarah took the card but didn't look at it immediately. The idea of talking to another damaged warrior felt both appealing and terrifying. Part of her wanted to connect with someone who might understand her struggle, but another part resisted the idea of joining what felt like a support group for broken soldiers. The drive home was quiet except for the radio playing softly in the background. Sarah's small apartment felt emptier than usual when she walked through the door, her footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors. The space was spartanly furnished, but immaculately organized, a reflection of her military background and the discipline that had defined her life. On the kitchen counter sat a stack of mail that had been accumulating over the past few days. Bills, advertisements, and official-looking envelopes from the Navy that Sarah hadn't had the courage to open yet. She knew they contained information about her medical board review and potential discharge proceedings. The thought of being forced out of the service because of physical limitations felt like a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed to achieve. Sarah made herself a simple dinner with her left hand, a process that took twice as long as it should have, and resulted in considerable frustration. Every simple task had become a challenge, from buttoning shirts to tying shoes to opening containers. These daily reminders of her injury felt like small defeats that accumulated throughout each day. After dinner, she sat on her couch and, finally, looked at the business card Dr. Rodriguez had given her. Jennifer Walsh, Adaptive Warrior Foundation. The organization's motto was printed in small text at the bottom of the card: redefining strength, rebuilding lives. Sarah turned the card over in her good hand, wondering what it meant to redefine strength when strength had always been her defining characteristic. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her teammate Jake, checking in as he had done every few days since the accident. Jake had been with Sarah through multiple deployments and understood her better than most people in her life. His messages were always brief and to the point, respecting her need for space while letting her know she wasn't forgotten. How did the appointment go? Still planning to beat up bad guys with one arm? The message included an emoji of a flexing bicep, which made Sarah smile despite herself. Jake had a way of using humor to address serious situations without minimizing their importance. Sarah typed back with her left hand, a slow and clumsy process that frustrated her. Doc says I'm healing well, but might not get back to 100%. Still processing what that means for everything. His response came quickly. You're the toughest person I know. Whatever comes next, you'll figure out and probably be better at it than anyone else. Call me if you need to talk or if you want me to come over and help you open jars. The reference to her peanut butter incident made Sarah laugh out loud, a sound that felt foreign in her quiet apartment. Jake somehow always knew exactly what to say to remind her that she was still herself, injury or no injury. Their friendship had been forged in the crucible of military service, and she knew it would survive whatever challenges lay ahead. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about her conversation with Dr. Rodriguez. The possibility of medical discharge felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an unknown future that terrified her more than any enemy she had ever faced in combat. Her identity had been so completely wrapped up in being a SEAL that she struggled to imagine who she might be without that role. She thought about her childhood in Montana, where her father had taught her to ride horses, hunt, and shoot. Even then, she had been drawn to challenges that others avoided, always pushing herself to go faster, higher, and further than anyone expected a girl from a small farming community to go. The military had given her a place where that drive and determination were not just welcomed but rewarded. Now, as she flexed the fingers of her right hand and felt the familiar ache that had become her constant companion, Sarah wondered if that drive would be enough to carry her through whatever came next. The card from Jennifer Walsh sat on her nightstand, and in the darkness, she could almost feel it calling to her. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of rappelling down endless cliffs and reaching for ropes that always seemed just beyond her grasp. In her dreams, her right arm was strong and, sure, capable of anything she asked of it. But each time she woke, reality crashed over her like a cold wave, reminding her that some things, once broken, could never be completely whole again. The next morning brought another day of small challenges and minor defeats. Sarah struggled with her coffee maker, dropped her keys twice, and spent 10 minutes trying to tie her running shoes before giving up and switching to slip-on sneakers. Each frustration built on the last, creating a mountain of anger that she didn't know how to climb. By noon, she found herself holding Jennifer Walsh's business card again, staring at the phone number printed in neat black digits. Part of her wanted to call immediately, to connect with someone who might understand the unique pain of losing the physical capabilities that had defined her career. But another part of her resisted, viewing the call as an admission of defeat. Sarah had always been someone who solved her own problems, who pushed through difficulties with sheer determination and willpower. The idea of seeking help felt foreign and uncomfortable, like putting on clothes that didn't fit properly. But as she sat in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the silence of a life that had been put on hold, she began to realize that some challenges couldn't be overcome alone. The afternoon sun streamed through her living room window, casting geometric patterns on the floor that shifted slowly as the earth turned. Sarah watched the light move across her hardwood floors and thought about motion, about change, about the inevitability of things being different than they were before. Perhaps resistance to change was just another form of being stuck, another way of refusing to adapt to new circumstances. Her phone sat on the coffee table in front of her, waiting for her to make a decision that might determine the direction of her life for years to come. Sarah picked up Jennifer Walsh's business card one more time and made her choice. The Adaptive Warrior Foundation occupied a converted warehouse in downtown San Diego, its industrial exterior giving no hint of the transformation happening inside. Sarah parked her car across the street and sat for several minutes, watching people come and go through the main entrance. She noticed immediately that many of the individuals entering the building showed visible signs of injury or disability: prosthetic limbs, wheelchairs, crutches, and other mobility aids. Yet there was something different about the way these people carried themselves, a confidence and purpose that surprised her. 3 days had passed since Sarah finally worked up the courage to call Jennifer Walsh. The conversation had been brief but compelling. Jennifer's voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat, but it was tempered with a warmth that put Sarah at ease. They had arranged to meet at the Foundation's facility, and Jennifer had simply said, "Come ready to be surprised by what's possible." As Sarah crossed the street and approached the entrance, she could hear sounds of activity from inside: weights clanging, voices calling out encouragement, and music playing at a moderate volume. A sign by the door read, "Welcome, warriors. Check your excuses at the door," which made Sarah both smile and wince simultaneously. The interior of the building had been completely transformed from its industrial origins. The space was divided into several areas: a fully equipped gym with adaptive equipment, a rock climbing wall with various difficulty levels, a workshop area filled with tools and materials, and several smaller rooms that appeared to be set up for meetings or counseling sessions. The walls were covered with photographs of people engaged in various activities: skiing, cycling, rock climbing, martial arts, many of whom were clearly dealing with significant physical challenges. "You must be Sarah," a voice said behind her. Sarah turned to see a woman approaching with a confident stride, despite the fact that her left leg was clearly a prosthetic device. Jennifer Walsh was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 30s, with short auburn hair and intense green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore workout clothes that showed off well-developed arm and shoulder muscles, and her handshake was firm and sure. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Sarah replied, trying not to stare at Jennifer's prosthetic leg. She had seen plenty of injured warriors during her military career, but this was her first time meeting someone who seemed so completely at peace with their limitations. "Dr. Rodriguez told me a little about your situation," Jennifer said as she led Sarah through the facility. "Multiple fractures, nerve damage, possible medical discharge. Sound about right?" Sarah nodded, surprised by the matter-of-fact way Jennifer discussed what felt like life-altering circumstances. She said, "You might be able to help me figure out what comes next. Honestly, I'm not sure there is a next for someone like me." Jennifer stopped walking and turned to face Sarah directly. "Someone like you? You mean someone who's spent years training to be the best warrior on the planet? Someone who's overcome challenges that would break most people? Someone who's proven repeatedly that limits are just starting points?" Her voice carried a challenge that Sarah recognized from her military training. "Someone whose career depends on physical capabilities I may never get back," Sarah replied, her frustration evident in her voice. "I can't even open a jar of peanut butter without help." Jennifer laughed, not unkindly, and resumed walking through the facility. 6 months after I lost my leg, I sat in my apartment and cried because I couldn't put on a sock. Today I'm going to show you something that might change your perspective on what's possible. They stopped at the entrance to the gym area, where Sarah could see a dozen people engaged in various forms of exercise. A man with no arms was doing pull-ups using specially designed equipment that allowed him to hook his legs over the bar. A woman with one leg was deadlifting what appeared to be a considerable amount of weight. Two people who appear to be amputees were sparring on wrestling mats, their intensity and skill evident even to Sarah's trained eye. "This is Maria," Jennifer said, introducing Sarah to the woman who was deadlifting. "Former Marine, lost her leg to an IED in Afghanistan. That weight she's lifting? 320 pounds, more than she could lift before her injury." Maria looked up from her workout and smiled at Sarah, sweat glistening on her forehead. "New recruit?" she asked Jennifer, then turned to Sarah. "What's your story?" Sarah found herself explaining her situation for what felt like the 100th time since her accident, but something about the environment made it easier. These people understood the language of military service, the importance of physical capability, and the devastation of losing what defined you. They nodded with understanding rather than pity. Right arm, huh? Maria said, wiping her hands on a towel. That's tough for someone whose livelihood depends on precision. But you know what? I bet you could outshoot most people with your left hand after a few months of practice. Want to see something cool? Without waiting for an answer, Maria led them to a corner of the gym where several people were practicing with various weapons at a shooting range that had been set up with enhanced safety measures. Sarah watched in amazement as a man with no right arm consistently hit targets a considerable distance using a rifle that had been modified to accommodate his specific needs. That's Tony, Jennifer explained. Former Army Ranger. Lost his arm in a training accident similar to yours. He's now one of the top competitive shooters in the country. Turns out that when you can't rely on your dominant side anymore, your brain finds new ways to excel. Sarah watched Tony's technique carefully, noting how he had adapted his stance and grip to compensate for his missing limb. His shots were precise and consistent, and his confidence was evident in every movement. How long did it take him to get this good? About a year of dedicated practice, Jennifer replied. But here's the thing. He's not just good despite his injury. In some ways, he's better because of it. When you can't rely on old habits and muscle memory, you're forced to think more carefully about every aspect of your technique. They spent the next hour touring the facility and meeting various members. Sarah met a former Navy pilot who had lost both legs and was now a competitive cyclist, a Marine who had lost an arm and become a renowned sculptor, and a Special Forces soldier who had suffered brain trauma and was now studying to become a doctor. Each person's story was different, but they all shared a common thread of refusing to let their injuries define their limitations. In the workshop area, Sarah watched a group of people designing and building adaptive equipment for various sports and activities. The atmosphere was one of innovation and creativity, with individuals combining their military problem-solving skills with their personal needs to create solutions that didn't exist in the commercial market. The thing about warriors, Jennifer said as they observed the workshop activity, is that we're natural problem solvers. Give us an obstacle, and we figure out how to overcome it. The only difference now is that some of our obstacles are internal rather than external. Jennifer led Sarah to a quieter area where they could sit and talk more privately. The space was comfortable, but not overly formal, with large windows that let in natural light and a view of the San Diego skyline. On the walls were more photographs, but these were different from the action shots in the gym area. These showed people with their families, graduating from school, starting businesses, and engaging in everyday activities that demonstrated full, meaningful lives. Dr. Rodriguez probably told you that I was Special Forces before my injury, Jennifer began. What she might not have mentioned is that losing my leg was the best thing that ever happened to me. Sarah looked skeptical. I find that hard to believe. I understand why you would, Jennifer continued. For the first 6 months after my injury, I felt exactly the way you feel right now. Like everything I had worked for was gone. Like I was broken beyond repair. Like the person I had been before was dead and buried. Jennifer paused to pour 2 cups of coffee from a pot that sat on a small table between them. Sarah noticed that she performed these simple tasks with an unconscious competence that spoke of complete adaptation to her physical reality. The turning point came when I realized I was grieving for the wrong thing, Jennifer continued. I was mourning the loss of my leg, but what I was really grieving was the loss of my identity. I had confused my physical capabilities with my worth as a person. Once I separated those two things, I could start building something new. But how do you separate them when your entire career is based on physical performance? Sarah asked. I mean, I get that you've built something meaningful here, but I'm a SEAL. That's not just what I do, it's who I am. Jennifer nodded with understanding. That's exactly what I thought too. And you're right that being a SEAL is a huge part of who you are. But it's not the only part, and it's not even the most important part. The qualities that made you a successful SEAL, determination, courage, adaptability, leadership, those don't live in your right arm. They live in your mind and your spirit. Over the next hour, Jennifer shared more of her own story. She described the dark period after her injury when she had contemplated suicide, the slow process of accepting help from others, and the gradual realization that her military skills were applicable to civilian challenges in ways she had never considered. She talked about starting the Adaptive Warrior Foundation with a small grant and a handful of volunteers, and watching it grow into a nationally recognized program that had helped thousands of veterans transition to meaningful post-military lives. The thing is, Jennifer said as their conversation began to wind down, you're already adapting. You probably don't realize it, but every day you're figuring out new ways to do things. Your brain is rewiring itself to compensate for your injury. That's not weakness. That's evolution in real time. Sarah thought about the past few weeks and realized Jennifer was right. She had unconsciously developed new techniques for daily tasks, found workarounds for activities that had become challenging, and even discovered that some things were easier to do with her left hand than they had been with her right. The changes had been so gradual that she hadn't noticed them happening. What would you recommend as next steps? Sarah asked, feeling for the first time since her accident that there might actually be a path forward. I'd like you to come back tomorrow and spend a full day with us, Jennifer replied. Try some of the adaptive training, meet more of our members, and see how your body responds to different types of challenges. But more importantly, I want you to start thinking about what you want to build rather than what you've lost. As they walked back through the facility toward the exit, Sarah noticed details she had missed during her initial tour. A bulletin board covered with thank you letters from veterans who had found new careers through the program. A trophy case filled with awards earned by foundation members in various competitive events. A whiteboard covered with job announcements for positions specifically seeking veterans with disabilities. One more thing, Jennifer said as they reached Sarah's car. I want you to stop thinking of yourself as broken. You're not broken, you're different. And different can be better if you let it be. Driving home, Sarah's mind raced with new possibilities and perspectives. The anger and frustration that had been her constant companions since the accident were still there, but they had been joined by something else, a spark of curiosity about what she might be capable of accomplishing. For the first time in weeks, she found herself looking forward rather than backward. That evening, Sarah called Jake to tell him about her experience at the foundation. His response was enthusiastic and supportive, but not surprising. I always knew you were too stubborn to let something like this keep you down, he said. Besides, you've always been the one coming up with creative solutions when the rest of us were stuck thinking conventionally. It's different when it's your own life you're trying to figure out, Sarah replied. But I think I'm starting to see some possibilities I hadn't considered before. Like what? Sarah paused, trying to put her emerging thoughts into words. I don't know exactly yet, but maybe there are ways to use my training and experience that don't require perfect physical capabilities. Maybe there are challenges I haven't thought of taking on. That night, Sarah slept better than she had since her accident. Her dreams were still occasionally troubled by images of falling and breaking, but they were also filled with new scenes, teaching, building, leading, and accomplishing things she hadn't previously imagined. When she woke the next morning, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, excitement about the day ahead. As she prepared to return to the Adaptive Warrior Foundation, Sarah looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw something different. The woman staring back at her was still injured, still facing significant challenges, and still uncertain about her future. But there was also a new determination in her eyes, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. Sarah Mitchell was beginning to understand that this was not the end of her story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. And for the first time since her accident, she was curious to see what she might write next. Sarah arrived at the Adaptive Warrior Foundation early the next morning, determined to approach her full-day experience with the same intensity she had once brought to SEAL training. Jennifer was waiting for her in the lobby with a schedule and a knowing smile that suggested she understood exactly what Sarah was thinking. First lesson of adaptive training, Jennifer said as they walked toward the locker room. Forget everything you think you know about your limitations. Today we're going to test what's actually possible, not what you assume is possible. The first activity was marksmanship training, something that struck directly at the heart of Sarah's professional identity. Throughout her military career, her shooting accuracy had been legendary among her peers. She had qualified as an expert marksman with multiple weapon systems and had earned commendations for her precision under pressure. Now, as she stood at the shooting range holding a modified rifle designed for one-handed operation, Sarah felt the weight of everything she had lost. The instructor was Marcus, a former Marine sniper who had lost his right arm in an explosion in Iraq. His approach to teaching was direct and practical, with no allowances made for self-pity or excuses. He positioned Sarah at the firing line and began explaining the modifications to the weapon and the techniques for compensating for single-handed operation. The first thing you need to understand, Marcus said, adjusting Sarah's stance and grip, is that accuracy isn't about strength or even dexterity. It's about consistency, breathing, and mental focus, all things that are completely independent of which hand you're using. Sarah's first few shots were erratic and frustrating. The unfamiliar grip felt awkward, and her muscle memory kept trying to engage her right arm for support that was no longer available. She found herself growing angry with each missed shot, the familiar pattern of frustration and self-criticism that had plagued her since the accident. "Stop," Marcus said after Sarah's fifth consecutive miss. "What are you thinking about right now?" "How much this sucks," Sarah replied honestly. "How I used to be able to hit targets twice this distance without even thinking about it." "Exactly the problem," Marcus said. "You're shooting against your past self instead of shooting at the target. The person you used to be isn't standing on this firing line. You are, and you're different now, which means you need different techniques." Marcus spent the next hour breaking down Sarah's shooting technique into its component parts and rebuilding it from scratch. Instead of trying to adapt her old methods, he taught her completely new approaches that were designed specifically for her current capabilities. The process was humbling but also enlightening, as Sarah began to understand that adaptation meant learning entirely new skills rather than modifying old ones. By the end of the marksmanship session, Sarah was hitting the center of the target with reasonable consistency. Her accuracy wasn't yet at her former level, but the improvement over the course of a single morning was dramatic and encouraging. More importantly, she was beginning to experience the satisfaction of mastering a new challenge rather than the frustration of failing at an old one. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked as they cleaned and stored the weapons. "Different," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the honesty of her answer. "Like I'm learning to be someone new instead of trying to fix someone who's broken." "Now you're getting it," Marcus said with approval. "That's the difference between rehabilitation and transformation." The next activity was rock climbing, something Sarah had never attempted before her injury. The climbing wall at the foundation was equipped with various routes of different difficulty levels, and several adaptive climbing techniques had been developed to accommodate different types of disabilities. Jennifer introduced Sarah to Elena, a former Army helicopter pilot who had lost her left leg in a crash and was now an accomplished rock climber. "Climbing is perfect for someone in your situation," Elena explained as she fitted Sarah with a specially designed harness. "It's not about raw strength or speed. It's about problem-solving, balance, and using your body efficiently. Plus, it builds confidence in ways that traditional therapy never could." Sarah looked up at the climbing wall with skepticism. The routes appeared challenging even for someone with full physical capabilities, and she couldn't imagine how she would manage with limited use of her right arm. But Elena's confidence was infectious, and Sarah found herself willing to try something that would have seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. The initial attempts were clumsy and exhausting. Sarah's right arm could provide some support, but couldn't bear her full weight, which meant she had to rely heavily on her legs and left arm. The movements felt unnatural and inefficient, and several times she found herself hanging from the safety rope after losing her grip or balance. "You're trying to climb like a person with two good arms," Elena called up from below. "Stop fighting your injury and start using it. Your right arm may not be strong, but it can still help with balance and positioning. Work with what you have instead of against what you don't have." Gradually, Sarah began to understand what Elena meant. Instead of trying to grip hold with her right hand, she learned to use that arm for balance and leverage while her left hand and both legs did the primary work of supporting and moving her body. The technique was completely different from anything she had seen other climbers do, but it was effective for her specific situation. By the third route, Sarah was beginning to feel something she hadn't experienced since before her accident: the pure joy of physical challenge and accomplishment. When she reached the top of a moderately difficult route and looked down at the ground below, she felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with comparing her current performance to her past capabilities. "How was that?" Elena asked as Sarah rappelled back to the ground. "Terrifying and amazing," Sarah replied, breathing heavily but smiling. "I never thought I'd be able to do something like that again." Again, Elena raised an eyebrow. "You've never rock climbed before. This isn't something you're doing again. It's something you're doing for the first time. That's the beauty of adaptation. It opens up possibilities that never existed before." The afternoon brought a different type of challenge: a workshop on adaptive technology and innovation. Sarah found herself in a room with a dozen other veterans, all working on projects related to improving their own lives or the lives of others facing similar challenges. The atmosphere was one of creativity and collaboration, with people sharing ideas and expertise across different types of injuries and backgrounds. Sarah was paired with David, a former Navy engineer who had lost both arms in an accident and was now developing prosthetic devices for other amputees. Their project for the day was to design a tool that would help someone with limited hand function to perform fine motor tasks like writing or drawing. "The key to adaptive design," David explained as they sketched out ideas, "is to stop thinking about recreating normal function and start thinking about creating better function. Sometimes a limitation forces you to find solutions that are actually superior to the original approach." Working with David challenged Sarah to think creatively about problem-solving in ways she hadn't considered before. Her military training had always emphasized adaptation and improvisation, but those skills had typically been applied to tactical situations. Now, she was learning to apply the same principles to personal challenges and everyday tasks. Their design session produced several promising concepts for adaptive writing tools, but more importantly, it gave Sarah a glimpse of how her analytical and strategic thinking skills could be applied to helping others overcome physical limitations. She found herself energized by the collaborative process and intrigued by the possibility of using her military experience in completely new ways. As the day progressed, Sarah participated in adaptive martial arts training, modified strength exercises, and a group discussion about transitioning from military to civilian life. Each activity challenged her to reconsider her assumptions about what she was capable of accomplishing and what constituted meaningful achievement. The martial arts session was particularly eye-opening. The instructor, a former Special Forces operator named Mike who used a wheelchair, demonstrated techniques that were specifically designed for people with various physical limitations. Sarah learned that effective combat skills could be developed using different principles and techniques than those she had mastered in her military training. "The thing about traditional martial arts," Mike explained as he demonstrated a technique for defending against a standing attacker from a seated position, "is that they assume everyone has the same basic physical capabilities. Adaptive martial arts start from the premise that everyone is different, so the techniques are more individualized and often more effective." Sarah practiced several techniques that accommodated her limited right arm function and was surprised to discover that some of them actually felt more natural and powerful than the methods she had learned in military combative training. The experience was both humbling and encouraging, showing her that adaptation could lead to genuine improvement rather than just compensation for loss. During the group discussion, Sarah listened to stories from other veterans who had successfully transitioned from military service to civilian careers after dealing with significant injuries. She heard from a former Marine who had become a successful business owner, a Navy pilot who had become a counselor for other veterans, and an Army medic who had gone back to school to become a physician. "The hardest part," said Rachel, the former Marine business owner, "wasn't learning to live with my injury. It was learning to live without the identity that had defined me for so long. Once I figured out that I was more than just my military role, I could start building something new." "But how do you know what to build?" Sarah asked. "How do you figure out what's possible when everything you thought you knew about yourself has changed?" "You experiment," replied Dr. James, the former Army medic. "You try things that interest you, even if they seem impossible. You fail at some things and succeed at others. Gradually, you start to see patterns and preferences that point you toward what you're meant to do next." As the day wound down, Jennifer asked Sarah to reflect on her experiences and share her thoughts with the group. Standing in front of a dozen veterans who had faced their own versions of life-changing challenges, Sarah felt both vulnerable and empowered. "This morning I came here thinking about all the things I couldn't do anymore," she began. "But after today, I'm thinking more about things I might be able to do that I never tried before. I'm still scared about the future, but I'm also starting to get curious about what it might look like." The group responded with understanding nods and words of encouragement. Sarah realized that she was not alone in her struggle, and that the path she was beginning to explore had been traveled by others who had found meaning and purpose on the other side of their injuries. As she drove home that evening, Sarah's mind was filled with new images and possibilities. She thought about the satisfaction of hitting targets with her adapted shooting technique, the exhilaration of reaching the top of the climbing wall, and the creativity involved in designing adaptive solutions. For the first time since her accident, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow. That night, Sarah called her father in Montana to tell him about her day. Her father listened quietly as she described her experiences, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just allowing her to process her thoughts out loud. When she finished her story, there was a long pause before he spoke. "Sounds like you're starting to remember who you are underneath all that military training," he said finally. "You were always the kid who figured out how to do things differently when the normal way didn't work. I'm glad to hear that person is still in there." "I'm not sure what comes next, Dad," Sarah said. "The military is talking about medical discharge, and I don't know what I'm qualified to do in the civilian world." "You're qualified to solve problems and help people," her father replied. "Everything else is just details you'll figure out as you go. You always have." After hanging up the phone, Sarah sat in her quiet apartment and thought about her father's words. He was right that she had always been someone who found alternative approaches to challenges, but she had forgotten that aspect of herself during her years of military service. The structured environment of the Navy had provided clear paths and expectations, but now she was in uncharted territory where creativity and adaptability would be more important than following established procedures. Sarah opened her laptop and began researching programs for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. She found information about education benefits, entrepreneurship programs, and organizations that help veterans find meaningful work in various fields. For the first time, she began to see her military experience as a foundation for future growth rather than a peak that could never be reached again. As she prepared for bed, Sarah looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw something different than she had seen just a few days earlier. The woman looking back at her was still dealing with a significant injury, still facing an uncertain future, and still working through the emotional challenges of a life-changing event. But there was also a new sense of possibility in her eyes, a recognition that change could be growth rather than loss. Sarah Mitchell was beginning to understand that her story was not ending, but transforming. And for the first time since her accident, she was excited to see what the next chapter might bring. 2 months had passed since Sarah's first visit to the Adaptive Warrior Foundation, and her life had settled into a new rhythm that would have been unimaginable during the dark weeks following her accident. She had become a regular participant in the Foundation's programs, spending 3 days each week working on adaptive training, skill development, and what Jennifer called possibility exploration. The Military Medical Board had concluded its review of Sarah's case, and the results were both expected and difficult to accept. Her injury was deemed incompatible with continued service as a Navy SEAL, and she was offered a medical discharge with full benefits. The formal end of her military career felt like attending her own funeral, even though she had known for weeks that this outcome was inevitable. Sarah sat in her apartment, reading through the discharge paperwork, feeling a complex mix of sadness and relief. The sadness was obvious. She was saying goodbye to the identity and career that had defined her adult life. But the relief was more surprising. For the first time in months, she was free from the uncertainty about her future status and could focus entirely on building whatever came next. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Jennifer's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah answered with genuine pleasure. Their relationship had evolved beyond mentor and student into something resembling friendship, though Jennifer never let Sarah forget that she was still in the early stages of her adaptation journey. How did the medical board meeting go? Jennifer asked without preamble. She had been through her own discharge process and understood exactly what Sarah was experiencing. Officially discharged as of next month, Sarah replied. Full benefits, honorable discharge, all the paperwork you'd expect. It's done. How are you feeling about it? Sarah paused to consider the question seriously. Sad, obviously, but also ready to move forward. I've been in limbo for so long that even a difficult decision feels better than no decision. Good, Jennifer said with satisfaction, because I have something I want to discuss with you. Can you come in this afternoon? There's an opportunity one think you should consider. 3 hours later, Sarah found herself in Jennifer's office at the Foundation, facing a conversation that would reshape her understanding of what her post-military life might look like. Jennifer had assembled a small group of people around her conference table, including Dr. Rodriguez, Marcus from a shooting program, and 2 people Sarah didn't recognize. Sarah, Jennifer began, I'd like you to meet Dr. Patricia Chun from the Veterans Administration and Colonel Robert Martinez, who's recently retired from Special Operations Command. They're here because we've been working on something that we think you might be perfect for. Dr. Chun, a petite woman with an authoritative presence, leaned forward to address Sarah directly. We've been developing a pilot program for the VA that would pair recently discharged veterans with adaptive training specialists to help them transition to civilian life. The program would combine physical rehabilitation, career counseling, and practical skills training. Colonel Martinez, whose bearing still clearly reflected his military background despite his civilian clothes, picked up the explanation. What we need is someone who understands both the military mindset and the adaptive process. Someone who can relate to newly injured veterans because they've been through it themselves, but who also has the training and experience to lead others. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she began to understand what they were proposing. Are you offering me a job? We're offering you a chance to create a job, Jennifer replied. The position doesn't exist yet, but the funding has been approved for a 1-year pilot program. If it's successful, it could be expanded nationally. You would be the first adaptive training coordinator for injured veterans in the VA system. Dr. Chin slid a folder across the table to Sarah. The position would require you to complete certification training in adaptive techniques, counseling skills, and program administration. It would be based here at the Foundation initially, with the goal of eventually establishing similar programs at VA facilities across the country. Sarah opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. The job description was unlike anything she had ever considered, combining elements of teaching, counseling, program development, and advocacy. The salary was reasonable, and the benefits were comprehensive. But more importantly, The work seemed to offer exactly the kind of meaning and purpose that she had been searching for since her injury. "Why me?" Sarah asked, looking around the table at the assembled group. "I'm still figuring out my own adaptation process. How can I help others when I don't have all the answers myself?" Marcus spoke up for the first time during the meeting. "Because you're asking the right questions and you're not pretending to have it all figured out. The veterans who come to us don't need someone who's perfect. They need someone who's real, who understands their struggle, and who can show them that adaptation is possible. Plus," Jennifer added, "you have leadership experience that most people in this field lack. You know how to motivate people, how to assess their capabilities, and how to push them beyond what they think they can accomplish. Those are exactly the skills this position requires." Colonel Martinez leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah carefully. "I've read your service record. Your performance evaluations consistently mention your ability to inspire others and your talent for developing innovative solutions to complex problems. Those qualities don't disappear because of an injury." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of this opportunity. For months, she had been focused on adapting to her own limitations and figuring out how to navigate daily life with her injury. The possibility of turning her experience into a career that could help other veterans had not occurred to her, but now it seemed obvious and compelling. "What would the training involve?" she asked, her practical nature asserting itself even as her emotions swirled with excitement and uncertainty. Dr. Chun consulted her notes before responding. 6 months of intensive training in adaptive techniques, psychology, program administration, and veteran-specific counseling approaches. You'd split your time between classroom learning, hands-on practice with current foundation members, and rotation through various VA facilities to understand the broader system. And after the training period, you'd spend 6 months implementing the pilot program here, working with newly injured veterans as they transition from military to civilian life. We'd evaluate the results and, if successful, begin planning for national expansion. Jennifer had remained quiet during much of this discussion, but now she addressed Sarah with the direct honesty that characterized their relationship. "This is a big decision, and you don't have to make it today, but I will say that I think you're uniquely qualified for this work, and I believe it could give you the sense of purpose you've been searching for." Sarah looked around the table at the faces of people who had become important to her over the past 2 months. Each of them had played a role in helping her see possibilities where she had initially seen only limitations. Now, they were offering her a chance to do the same for others. "Can I have some time to think about it?" Sarah asked. "Of course," Dr. Chin replied. "We need an answer within 2 weeks, but take whatever time you need to make the right decision for yourself." After the meeting ended and the others had left, Sarah remained in Jennifer's office to discuss the opportunity privately. Jennifer poured 2 cups of coffee and settled in her chair with the relaxed posture of someone preparing for a longer conversation. "What are you really thinking?" Jennifer asked. "I can see the wheels turning, but I can't tell if they're moving toward yes or no. I'm thinking that 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be considering a career in veteran services, I would have laughed at them," Sarah replied honestly. "It never occurred to me that my military experience could be valuable in a civilian context. And now?" Sarah paused to gather her thoughts before responding. "Now I'm starting to understand that the skills that made me a good SEAL, leadership, problem-solving, adaptability, those don't become irrelevant just because I'm not in the military anymore. Maybe they can be applied in different ways." Jennifer nodded with approval. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that would make you successful in this position. But I want you to be realistic about what you'd be taking on. Working with newly injured veterans can be emotionally challenging. You'd be dealing with people who are going through exactly what you went through, and some of them won't be ready to hear what you have to offer." "You mean some of them will be like I was when I first came here?" Sarah said with a wry smile. "Angry, resistant, convinced that their life is over." "Exactly. And it will take patience, skill, and emotional resilience to help them see other possibilities. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah thought about her own journey over the past few months. remembering the dark periods when she had been convinced that her injury had ruined her life. She also thought about the gradual process of discovering new capabilities and perspectives that had brought her to this moment. "I think so," she said finally. "I mean, I know I need to learn a lot about counseling and program administration, but the core of what this job seems to be about, helping people see that adaptation is possible. That's something I understand now in a way I never could have before my injury." That evening, Sarah called Jake to discuss the opportunity. He listened carefully as she explained the details of the proposed position, occasionally asking questions, but mostly letting her think through the implications out loud. "It sounds perfect for you," he said when she finished. "You've always been the one the rest of us came to when we needed to figure out how to approach a difficult problem. Now you'd be doing that professionally." "But it's such a departure from everything I've done before," Sarah protested. "I don't know anything about program administration or counseling or working in government bureaucracy." "So you'll learn," Jake replied with characteristic directness. "You've learned everything else you've ever needed to know. Besides, the fact that it's different might be exactly why it's right for you." "What do you mean?" "I mean that maybe trying to recreate your old life in a slightly modified form isn't the answer. Maybe you need something completely new that uses your strengths in ways you've never considered before." After talking with Jake, Sarah spent the evening researching the Veterans Administration, adaptive training techniques, and career counseling approaches. The more she learned about the field, the more interested she became. She discovered that there was a significant gap in services for recently injured veterans, particularly those transitioning from elite military units to civilian life. She also found research showing that peer support from veterans who had successfully adapted to similar injuries was one of the most effective forms of intervention. The proposed position would allow her to provide exactly that type of support while also developing new approaches to adaptive training. Over the next few days, Sarah visited several VA facilities to observe existing programs and speak with staff members about the challenges they faced in serving injured veterans. What she saw confirmed her growing belief that there was a real need for the type of program she was being asked to develop. At one facility, she met with a group of recently injured veterans who were struggling with the transition from military to civilian life. Their stories were heartbreakingly familiar. The loss of identity, the frustration with physical limitations, the fear about an uncertain future. Sarah found herself naturally falling into a mentoring role, sharing her own experiences and offering practical advice about adaptation techniques. "You really get it," said David, a former Marine who had lost his leg in Afghanistan. "The counselors here are nice people, but they've never been where we are. They can't understand what it feels like to have your whole world turned upside down like this. Maybe that's why they need someone like me in this system," Sarah thought to herself as she drove home from the facility. Someone who's been there and found a way through. 2 days before her deadline for responding to the job offer, Sarah made her decision. She called Jennifer early in the morning and asked if they could meet that afternoon to discuss her answer. When she arrived at the foundation, Jennifer was waiting in her office with a knowing smile that suggested she had already guessed what Sarah's decision would be. They sat in the comfortable chairs by the window, looking out at the San Diego skyline as they had during their first serious conversation months earlier. "I want to take the position," Sarah said without preamble. "I want to learn how to help other veterans the way you and everyone here helped me." Jennifer's smile broadened into a grin. "I was hoping that's what you'd say. When do you want to start?" "As soon as possible," Sarah replied. "I've been thinking about this for days, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. This feels like what I'm supposed to do next. Not because it's safe or familiar, but because it's meaningful and challenging in ways that matter to me." "It won't be easy," Jennifer warned, though her tone was encouraging rather than discouraging. "You'll be helping people work through some of the most difficult experiences of their lives. And you'll be doing it while you're still working through your own adaptation process." "I know," Sarah said, "but maybe that's actually an advantage. Maybe being in the process myself will help me relate to what they're going through in ways that someone who's completely finished with their own adaptation wouldn't be able to." Jennifer nodded with understanding. That's exactly the kind of insight that will make you good at this work. When can you start the training program? Next month, if that works with everyone's schedule. I want to finish up some personal things and make sure I'm ready to commit fully to this. Perfect. Dr. Chun will be thrilled, and I think you're going to be surprised by how much you enjoy the work. As Sarah drove home that afternoon, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been a highly trained warrior whose identity was completely tied to her physical capabilities and military role. Today, she was embarking on a career path that would use different skills and serve different purposes, but that felt just as meaningful and challenging as anything she had done in the military. Her right arm still ached every day, and she still struggled with certain physical tasks. But those limitations no longer felt like the defining characteristics of her life. Instead, they had become part of a larger story of adaptation and growth that was leading her toward opportunities she never could have imagined before her injury. That evening, Sarah called her father to tell him about her decision. His response was characteristically brief, but deeply supportive. "Sounds like you figured out how to turn your setback into your mission," he said. "Your mother would be proud." Sarah's mother had died when she was 12, but her father still spoke of her as if she were actively involved in their lives. It was a perspective that Sarah had always found comforting, and today it felt especially meaningful. "I think she would be," Sarah agreed. "I think she liked the idea that something good could come from something that seemed so terrible at the time." "That's how life works," her father replied. "The worst things and the best things are usually more connected than we realize at the time." As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she thought about the path that lay ahead of her. The training would be challenging, and the work itself would be emotionally demanding. But for the first time since her accident, she felt a sense of excitement about the future that had nothing to do with recovering what she had lost and everything to do with building something entirely new. Sarah Mitchell was no longer trying to get her old life back. She was ready to create a new one. 1 year had passed since Sarah Mitchell's life had been forever changed by a training accident that shattered her right arm and ended her career as a Navy SEAL. Now, as she stood before a classroom filled with recently injured veterans at the VA Medical Center in San Diego, she embodied a transformation that would have been unimaginable during those dark first weeks after her injury. The pilot program for Adaptive Veteran Services had exceeded everyone's expectations. Sarah had completed her certification training with distinction, combining her natural leadership abilities with newly acquired skills in counseling, program administration, and adaptive techniques. More importantly, she had discovered a passion for helping other veterans navigate the challenging transition from military service to civilian life after life-changing injuries. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah said to the group of 12 veterans assembled in the bright, modern classroom. "I know some of you don't want to be here. I know some of you think this is just another mandatory program you have to sit through before you can get back to feeling sorry for yourselves." The blunt opening drew surprised looks and a few uncomfortable chuckles from the group. Sarah had learned that her direct, no-nonsense approach resonated with veterans who were tired of being treated with kid gloves by well-meaning but inexperienced counselors. "I'm not here to blow sunshine up your ass or tell you that everything happens for a reason," Sarah continued, her tone softening slightly, but remaining firm. "I'm here because I've been where you are, and I want to show you what's possible when you stop fighting your new reality and start working with it." Among the veterans in her current group was Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a former Army combat medic who had lost both legs to an IED explosion in Afghanistan. Maria's anger and resistance to adaptive training had reminded Sarah strongly of her own early attitude, and she had been working specifically to break through Maria's defenses. "Let me guess," Maria said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're going to tell us that losing our abilities was the best thing that ever happened to us, and now we should be grateful for the opportunity to find our true purpose." Sarah smiled at the challenge. She had heard similar comments dozens of times over the past year, and she had developed effective ways to address the cynicism that often masked deeper fears and grief. "Actually, no," Sarah replied. "What happened to you sucks. What happened to all of us sucks. I wouldn't wish any of it on my worst enemy. But here's the thing, it happened anyway. So now we have a choice. We can spend the rest of our lives being angry about what we lost, or we can get curious about what we might be able to build." Sarah walked to the front of the classroom and stood directly in front of Maria. "I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. I'm a better leader now than I was before my injury. I'm more creative, more empathetic, and better at solving complex problems. Not despite my limitations, but because of them." "How is that possible?" asked Thomas, a former Marine who had lost his vision to a mortar explosion. His skepticism was evident in his voice, but Sarah could hear genuine curiosity underneath the doubt. "Because when you can't rely on the approaches that used to work, your brain finds new ways to accomplish your goals," Sarah explained, moving to the whiteboard at the front of the room. "When I was a SEAL, I had a very specific set of tools and techniques that I could rely on. They worked well, but they also limited my thinking to established patterns." Sarah began drawing a simple diagram on the board, illustrating the concept of neuroplasticity and adaptive learning. "After my injury, my brain had to create entirely new pathways to accomplish tasks that used to be automatic. That process of rewiring made me more flexible and creative in my thinking, not just about physical tasks, but about everything." She turned back to face the group. "Here's an example. Before my injury, I had never considered that I might have anything to offer as a teacher or counselor. Military service had given me one very specific identity, and I couldn't imagine being anything else. But when that identity was no longer available to me, I had to explore other aspects of myself that I had never developed." Sarah gestured around the classroom. "This work, helping veterans adapt to life-changing injuries, uses skills I didn't even know I had. Skills that might have remained dormant if I had been able to continue with my original career path." Over the next 2 hours, Sarah led the group through a series of exercises designed to help them identify transferable skills and explore new possibilities for their lives. She combined practical adaptive training with deeper discussions about identity, purpose, and resilience. The transformation in her students over the course of the 6-week program was consistently remarkable. Veterans who arrived angry, hopeless, and convinced that their lives were over gradually discovered new capabilities and possibilities. More importantly, they began to see their injuries as part of their story rather than the end of their story. After the morning session, Sarah met with Dr. Chun to discuss the program's ongoing evaluation and potential expansion. The pilot program had been so successful that the VA was preparing to implement similar programs at 10 additional facilities across the country, with Sarah training and supervising the new adaptive training coordinators. "The outcome data is extraordinary," Dr. Chun said as they reviewed the latest statistics. "Veterans who complete your program show significantly higher rates of successful civilian transition, lower levels of depression and anxiety, and greater satisfaction with their post-military lives compared to control groups. More importantly," Sarah added, "they're finding meaningful work and relationships. They're not just surviving their injuries, they're thriving because of what they've learned through the adaptation process." Dr. Chen nodded with satisfaction, which is exactly why the VA wants to expand the program nationally. "We'd like you to consider taking on the role of National Director of Adaptive Veteran Services. It would mean traveling extensively to train new staff and establish programs, but it would also give you the opportunity to help thousands of veterans across the country." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of excitement and nervousness that had become her response to new challenges over the past year. The position would be demanding and would require her to step even further outside her comfort zone, but it also represented the kind of meaningful impact she had discovered she wanted to make with her life. "I'd like some time to think about it," Sarah said, "but I'm definitely interested. This work has become more important to me than anything I've ever done, and the opportunity to expand it nationally is incredibly compelling. That afternoon, Sarah returned to the Adaptive Warrior Foundation for her weekly session with advanced participants in their program. These were veterans who had completed the basic adaptive training and were now working on more complex challenges and goals. Many of them had become leaders in their own right, mentoring newer participants and developing innovative adaptive techniques. Jennifer was waiting for her in the gym area, where a group of veterans was engaged in an adaptive CrossFit workout that Sarah had helped design. The exercises had been modified to accommodate various types of injuries and disabilities, but the intensity and competitiveness remained high. "How did the VA meeting go?" Jennifer asked as they watched Marcus lead the workout with his characteristic combination of encouragement and challenge. "They want to expand the program nationally and have offered me the director position," Sarah replied. "It would mean leaving San Diego and spending most of my time traveling, but it would also mean helping establish programs that could serve thousands of veterans." Jennifer smiled with a mixture of pride and what looked like anticipated loss. "It's exactly the kind of opportunity one hoped would come along for you. You've grown into this work in ways that have surprised even me." "I couldn't have done any of it without everything I learned here," Sarah said, gesturing around the foundation facility. "This place saved my life in more ways than one." "No," Jennifer replied firmly. "You saved your own life. We just provided some tools and a supportive environment. The work of transformation, that was all you." As they talked, Sarah noticed Maria Santos across the gym, working with Elena on an advanced climbing route. Maria had completed Sarah's VA program 2 months earlier and had become one of the foundation's most dedicated participants. More significantly, she had recently enrolled in a graduate program in occupational therapy with plans to specialize in working with injured veterans. "Maria seems to be doing well," Sarah observed. "She's incredible," Jennifer replied. "Last week she told me that she wants to design better prosthetic devices for amputees. She's already started working with some of the engineers who volunteer here to develop prototypes." Sarah watched Maria navigate the climbing wall with skill and confidence, using adaptive techniques, but also pushing her capabilities in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier. It was exactly the kind of transformation that made Sarah's work feel worthwhile, but it also reminded her of how much more could be accomplished with broader reach and resources. That evening, Sarah had dinner with Jake, who was visiting San Diego for a few days between deployments. Their friendship had deepened over the past year, as Jake had witnessed Sarah's transformation and had become one of her strongest supporters and advisors. "So what do you think about this national director position?" Jake asked as they walked along the waterfront after dinner. "It sounds like exactly the kind of impact you've been wanting to make." "I think it's an incredible opportunity," Sarah replied. "But it's also intimidating. Running a pilot program in one location is very different from overseeing a national initiative. There'd be politics, bureaucracy, budget constraints, all kinds of challenges I've never dealt with. Since when has not having experience with something stopped you from taking it on?" Jake asked with a grin. "Besides, you'd be learning as you go, which is how you've handled every major challenge in your life." Sarah laughed, recognizing the truth in his observation. "When you put it that way, it does sound like the logical next step. I've been thinking that maybe my injury wasn't just something that happened to me, but something that prepared me for work I wouldn't have been capable of before." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the empathy, creativity, and problem-solving skills I've developed through my own adaptation process are exactly what this work requires. If I had remained physically intact and continued my SEAL career, I never would have developed those capabilities or discovered this passion." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the lights of the city reflect off the water. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the dark despair of her initial injury through the gradual process of adaptation and discovery to the meaningful work she was now doing. "I'm going to take the position," she said suddenly, the decision crystallizing as she spoke the words aloud. "I thought you might," Jake replied with satisfaction. "When do you start?" I need to give the VA an answer tomorrow, but assuming they accept my conditions about maintaining ties to the foundation and having input on program design, probably within the next month. The next morning, Sarah met with Dr. Chun and formally accepted the position of National Director of Adaptive Veteran Services. The conversation included detailed discussions about program implementation, staff training, and performance metrics, but what excited Sarah most was the opportunity to ensure that the approaches that had been so successful in San Diego could be replicated and adapted for different regions and populations. Her final weeks in San Diego were busy with transition planning and saying goodbye to the people who had become her extended family at the foundation. The hardest conversation was with Jennifer, who had been not just a mentor, but a model for what was possible when someone fully embraced their post-injury life. "I want you to remember something as you take on this new role," Jennifer said during their final official meeting. "The most important thing you'll do is not the programs you design or the policies you implement. It's the example you set for other injured veterans about what's possible when someone refuses to be defined by their limitations." "I'll remember that," Sarah promised. "And I'll make sure that every program we establish maintains the same focus on possibility rather than limitation that I learned here." 6 months later, Sarah stood before a conference room filled with VA administrators, adaptive training coordinators, and injured veterans from across the country. The national program had been successfully launched at 15 facilities, with plans for further expansion already in development. The results were consistently positive, with participating veterans showing dramatic improvements in mental health, life satisfaction, and successful civilian transition. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came during a break in the conference, when a young Army veteran approached her with tears in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, struggling to find the right words, "I just wanted to thank you. 6 months ago, I was ready to give up. I didn't see any point in trying to adapt to life with one arm. But your program showed me that I could not only adapt, but that I could excel in ways I never imagined." "What are you doing now?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his journey. "I'm starting law school in the fall," he replied with obvious pride. "I want to advocate for veterans' rights. I never thought about being a lawyer before my injury, but working through your program helped me discover that I have a passion for justice and helping others navigate complex systems." As Sarah watched him walk away with confidence and purpose, she reflected on the full circle her own journey had taken. From the devastating accident that had seemed to end her meaningful career, through the difficult process of adaptation and discovery, to the profound satisfaction of helping others find their own paths through similar challenges. Her right arm still ached on cold days, and she still had limitations that occasionally frustrated her. But those physical realities had become background notes in a much larger symphony of purpose and accomplishment. She had not recovered her old life, but she had built something better, a career that used her deepest strengths in service of a cause that mattered profoundly to her. That evening, Sarah called her father to update him on the conference and the continued expansion of the program. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Not because you overcame your injury, but because you used it to become someone who could help others overcome theirs." "Thanks, Dad. I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant when you told me that strength comes from the mind rather than the body." "Actually," her father replied, "I think you've taught me something new about that. Real strength comes from using whatever you have, mind, body, spirit, to serve something bigger than yourself. That's what you're doing now." As Sarah hung up the phone and prepared for the next day of the conference, she thought about the thousands of veterans who would benefit from the programs she was helping to establish across the country. Each of them would face their own version of the journey she had traveled, and each would discover their own unique ways of transforming limitation into strength. Sarah Mitchell had found her triumph not by overcoming her injury, but by embracing it as the catalyst for a life of deeper meaning and broader impact than she had ever imagined possible. Her fractured right arm had indeed changed everything, but instead of ending her story, it had become the beginning of her most important chapter.